So as the title suggests, I want to address two complementary aspects of language change today. So change in production, variation and change in production, but also listener perceptions of that change. And by perception, I specifically mean language attitudes. So essentially the role that sociolinguistic evaluation plays in the course of language change. Now, the social meaning of variation plays quite a crucial role in third wave approaches in the variationist paradigm. So Penny Eckert has said that the emphasis on stylistic practice in the third wave places speakers not as passive and stable carriers of dialect, but as stylistic agents instead. They tailor linguistic styles in ongoing and lifelong projects of self-construction and differentiation. So essentially the idea is that socially meaningful forms are used by speakers in an active way to construct and project some linguistic or some cultural identity. And there's plenty of examples of this in the literature, so even going back to Lebov's famous 1963 study of Martha's Vineyard, where attitudes towards island life play a crucial role in variation there. Eckert herself studied this in the Detroit High School, also a famous study of the jocks and the burnouts, and how burnouts index a rebellious style through use of negative concord and other sort of non-standard features. And even away from English as well, a study of Beijing yuppies using full tone and also avoiding local traditional variants to construct a sort of cosmopolitan persona. So that's fairly uncontroversial, fairly widespread, but what's less understood, I think, is the role that social meaning plays in language change, as opposed to purely local acts of synchronic variation. So Eckert and Lebov have actually addressed this in a very recent paper, and they do say that phonological change is frequently motivated and accelerated by the association of social meaning with the more concrete components of linguistic structure. But at the same time, there is evidence that social meaning is quite limited in terms of what it can actually attach to in language change. So in that very same paper, Eckert and Lebov also say that the more abstract elements, so these are things like chain shifts, parallel shifts and mergers, which kind of consist of the relationship between sounds rather than just the concrete realization of them in isolation. So more abstract elements like that aren't really subject to evaluation. They can go below the radar. And in an even more forthcoming paper, in fact, by Boone and Zotero, a much wider range of issues are raised, including the oppositional nature of social meaning and indexical values, and also the dynamic nature, as well as this issue of granularity. So it really is unclear at this point what role social meaning plays in the course of language change. And this is a debate which I want to shed some light on by looking at one particular feature, so NG in Northern English. This refers to the distribution of plain velar-nasal and velar-nasal stop clusters in stressed syllables. So things like words like wrong, singer, which can either be realised as wrong or wrong with a post-nasal stop, and likewise word medially and things like singer, singer. And it's variable in the northwest of England, also parts of the West Midlands. This is just an isogloss from the 1950s Survey of English Dialects. It's also, as you can see, attested in a very small pocket down south. It's just surviving there. And it's also been attested in a number of specific communities within that region, the northwest and the West Midlands. So the likes of Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham and so on, and also more rural areas. So although it's been quite widely attested, it's been quite understudied in terms of the exact factors that condition this variation. Well, first of all, I want to just address the historical profile of this, and then I'll address the social profile. So at a much earlier point in the history of English, these non-coalesced clusters were present for all speakers regardless of dialect, and also in all linguistic contexts. And this is going back to Proto-Germanic, to Old English. The G was historically present before being lost essentially in the late modern English period. So essentially a process of post-nasal G deletion was actuated, which targets syllable coders. And this has been quite well studied, at least the historical aspects of this. So it underwent a pathway of change which is directly predicted by one particular theory of sound change, the life cycle of phonological processes, which I can't go into too much detail about. That would be its own 20-minute talk. But essentially the crucial idea is that when these sound changes begin as a phonological rules, when they enter the phonology, they start applying post-lexically in the widest morphosyntactic domain, so that they're sensitive to phrasal content across word boundaries. Then over time, they'll get more embedded and start applying at the word level, where they just apply to the individual words, regardless of what comes before or after them. And then finally, they would progress to the stem level as well, at which point they actually apply to stems before word level suffixation takes place. The upshot of this is that as deletion progresses in this way, it begins to target a much wider set of environments, and I'll exemplify this in a second. So these different stages of NG have actually been reconstructed from historical evidence. So essentially the idea is, let's just take 4 example words, and these are sort of lexical sets, if you will. So a word like finger, singer, sing it, and sing tunes, which obviously differ in the morphological composition and also the phonological environment immediately surrounding these NG clusters. So before deletion began, we would get G presence everywhere. This is, pre-late modern English now. When deletion enters at the phrase level, we see that it applies in something like sing tunes, so pre-consonantally, because it's a coda targeting rule. When it's pre-vocalic, it remains present, because it can syllabify as an onset, even across word boundaries, and save itself from deletion. Now when it enters the word level, what we see is that it begins to apply in something like sing it, because it's not sensitive to that sort of phrasal environment, the fact that the following word is vowel initial. And then we also get deletion in something like singer once it enters the stem level, because it can target the stem sing before the word level suffix attaches. So there's a sort of counter-bleeding environment there. But crucially, there's no deletion in words like finger and other monomorphemic items like that. And that's essentially the stage we're at the moment. So in most varieties of present-day English, that's the distribution. You get G presence in these root-based or monomorphemic items, as well as a few lexical exceptions, and G absence pretty much everywhere else. Now, the life cycle doesn't necessarily stop there, though. It can continue, and the next natural stage of change might involve rule generalization, which essentially means that it would expand from targeting weak position in the syllable, and it would expand and now target weak position in the prosodic foot instead. It will sort of climb up the prosodic hierarchy. And the upshot of that would be that you would get deletion in something like finger. There's no stem thing where it can target, but crucially it's non-foot initial. So a more general process of G deletion would target those environments. And it has been attested. So present day Scots, that's the case we find there. You get something like finger with no G. And also, and to some extent, German shows this distribution as well, a much more advanced stage of G deletion. So this is something that I wanted to address in my research. So I want to look at the synchronic variation in contemporary varieties in the northwest of England to see, is this stable or is it actually continuing to change? Are we seeing examples of rule generalization in the northwest? So I conducted 32 sociolinguistic interviews, a stratified sample, in quite a widespread variationist study of this variable. And I found that it wasn't stable, that it is still changing. But crucially, it's not the change that we expect. It's not rule generalization. So I've just plotted the change here. Essentially what we're seeing is, this is just the rate of G presence for individual speakers by date of birth in 2 different environments. And you can see pre-consonantally, it's quite stable there. Prepausally, it's undergoing quite a dramatic change in apparent time. So much so that for the very youngest speakers in the population sample, all of them pretty much have a categorical ban on phrase final velar nasal without a following stop. And crucially, all the other environments, segmental, prosodic environments, do remain stable. So pre-vocalic, pre-consonantal, and also the distinction between singer and singer, all of that remains stable. It's just the prepausal environment which is changing. Which is quite surprising, especially because the life cycle definitely doesn't predict that. If anything, prepausal environment should be quite deletion favouring, because the G remains in the coda. There's nothing for it to syllabify onto as an onset. So it's changing, but it's not the next natural progression along that same diachronic pathway of change. So this is quite separate from the regular life cycle of postnasal G deletion. So it seems to be an entirely new innovation. And my first thought when I saw that was, okay, this seems quite amenable to an analysis involving external factors. Is this driven by the social meaning of this form? Is it evaluation-driven change? So this is something I wanted to address with a separate perception study. And this was quite applicable in the case of this particular change because prepausal environments are quite salient and the psycholinguistic evidence to support that. So if this is a case of evaluation-driven change, if it's down to the social meaning of this form and speakers actively using it to sort of project a northern identity, you would expect it to be registered most strongly phrase finally, which of course this is what we see in. So, to address whether this is the case, I'm going to give a brief overview of the social profile of this change now. Now, unfortunately, there's not much direct evidence of how it's evaluated, at least until I did this study. So, good job I came along. So, this is clearly a regional variant. It's a dialectal form, so we might expect that it's quite stigmatised. It's contrasting with a standard form which is present in RP and so on, and all other varieties of English. And this does find some support from the literature, so G presence is favoured by lower socioeconomic groups, both in the Northwest and in the West Midlands. But at the same time, G is actually favoured in more formal speech styles, particularly word lists. So, and these two things usually parallel each other. The idea is that the variants favoured by higher social classes tend to be also favoured in more formal speech styles. But we're seeing a contradiction here. And it could be that G presence is perceived as posh, which has been claimed in the literature, so possibly due to orthographic influences. The G is obviously present in the spelling, it's historically conservative. It's actually the G absent form, which is the innovation, if you will. So there's a bit of contradiction here, and it's actually summarised quite nicely, I think, by Knowles, who says it's a conflict of local and national norms. And there's also an idea that salience, which we know can modulate evaluation and change, might actually be quite low in the case of this variable. So Wells has said it's not actually perceived as a crashing local accent feature, which ambitious, upwardly mobile northerners might want to try to modify or eliminate. I'm not sure if I'm ambitious or upwardly mobile, but I am a northerner, and this is certainly something that I haven't tried to eliminate from my speech. So I've conducted a perception experiment to supplement the production data, and I'll talk about how I sort of went about this to investigate this idea. So it's a match guys task, which, if you're not aware, is quite widely used in perceptual dialectology to sort of uncover language attitudes, essentially. And specifically, I use the newscaster paradigm, which is shown to prime over social-linguistic norms. So basically, subjects in this experiment are told they're going to hear a speaker auditioning for a role as a newsreader. And they're asked to rate these audition tapes, the speaker's just reading out some headlines, based on how professional the speaker sounds, how educated, how formal they sound, as well as how northern they sound in this case. So what I did was I recorded a single speaker of Manchester English, reading out this list of headlines which have NG in different positions, once with G presence and once with G absence. And then I cross-spliced those recordings so that essentially for each headline you have a pair of audio files, identical in every respect except from the presence or absence of G. And the idea then is that any difference in how they're evaluated can be attributed to that particular variable and provide some direct evidence of how it's evaluated by these speakers. So for the results, I'm just going to plot the difference score, which all I did was take, for each pair of headlines, so here, exact same audio file, but one with G presence, one with G absence. I just subtract the rating, which means that a positive value means that for that particular headline, for that particular speaker, for that particular descriptive scale, they rated the one with G presence higher. Value of 0 obviously indicates they were rated exactly the same, and a negative value means a lower rating for the G presence guys. So, on to the results. There's quite a lot in this figure, so I'll sort of break it down. Let's just focus first on the older subjects. So here what I've plotted is the difference score, so each point reflects the response from a single subject. You can see on the x-axis it's the actual difference score itself. So essentially, values to the left mean a negative rating for G presence, so they evaluated the more regionally widespread form more positively. Values more to the right mean that they rated the G presence form higher on that scale. And you can see on the y-axis I've got, that's not working, pre-vocalic environment, pre-pausal environment, and then pre-consonantal environment. And you can see also the individual panels refer to the descriptive scales. But essentially, there's no difference. So for the case of the older subjects, most of the difference scores were actually 0, regardless of the scale, regardless of environment. Only 17% of the responses were actually a non-zero difference score. So they're not really evaluating this variable at all. Now for young subjects, we can see quite a big difference. So there's a lot more variation. Now interestingly, it's not really clustered on one side of that figure. So there's no real agreement in terms of the evaluation of this form. There's just more variation. It's more subject to evaluation, but no real agreement on its content. unless we look at the northern scale, in which case we see a slight trend now moving towards the right. So it looks like there's more agreement at that first order of indexicality, but not so much at these higher level orders in terms of how it correlates with overt norms. So yeah, in this case, actually 64% of the different scores were non-zero, contrasting with 17%. So yeah, so there's two apparent time changes then in the indexicality of NG. It's increasing as a marker of northern dialect. It's becoming much more salient as a feature of the north and of northwest at least. And it's also now more susceptible to evaluation, possibly because of that. But there's no agreement on the content, on the directionality of that effect. And this actually runs contrary to what we expect. So Lvov's principle of uniform evaluation says that really communities should be defined by their adherence to a set of shared evaluative norms. And that's not what we find in here, and there's a number of reasons why that might be. Now, crucially, I didn't actually point this out, but both of these changes are independent of the environment in which NG occurs. So it's not sensitive to the environment in terms of whether it's precausal, prevocalid, preconsonantal. Even though in production, this change is very much restricted to one particular context. So I think this, coupled with the fact that there is no even agreement on the evaluation of this form, really suggests that it's not evaluation that's driving this change. So I'll briefly talk about an alternative account, which I think might be driving it. I think it's the functional rather than a social motivation here. So I think it could be used in discourse as a sort of turn-taking device. So in addition to existing suprasegmental cues to boundaries, so things like pitch, boundary tones, pre-boundary lengthening, and also the use of non-modal voice quality, so creaky voice, which is quite often more frequent at the end of phrases. These are all cues to a juncture in speech, essentially. So what this could be is actually a segmental cue to that. And it finds some support from actually completely independent phenomena. So I can't go into too much detail for time, but adjectivization is actually increasing, which is a very salient way of realising these clusters in Glasgow English. And it's actually favoured in the exact same segmental and prosodic environment. So you get it most for velars, after nasals, and also in phrase final position. So it looks like there's some sort of some phrase final strengthening going on, sort of indicate that there's a break in speech coming up. It's the end of the term. And also the exact same variable actually in Northern German varieties. It's actually voiceless because of word final devoicing, but they show variation between Engma and Engma K, word finally. And crucially, it's the non-coalesced form, again, favoured IP finally at the end of intonational phrases. So it looks like there might be something phonetically favourable about phrase final contexts and the use of this full and non-coalesced form. So just to briefly conclude, NG is very much a historical variable, so I couldn't go into too much detail about it today, but the synchronic variation really reflects the exact diachronic pathway of change. It's almost entirely predicted by internal factors related to the architecture of grammar. So essentially, G deletion applies cyclically at the stem, word and phrase level, and that determines the probability of G presence on the surface. And this is the idea that's quite important in the anthrochronica approach to variation and change. This idea that there's a real connection between the diachronic and synchronic explanation here. So it's very much a historical variable. It's very much not a social variable. This recent change in preposal context, which is very amenable to an analysis where evaluation plays a crucial role, we found that that's not the case. So until recently, at least, this was very much below the radar. And even now, there's no agreement on the actual evaluation of this form. So in terms of the wider implications, it highlights quite a crucial theoretical issue relating to whether we should be incorporating social meaning in explanatory models of change. So mainly the granularity at which evaluation applies, which again is this idea which has been hinted at by Eckert and Lvov in the 2017 paper. This idea that language change in production can be quite complex conditioning factors, but in terms of evaluation, it tends to be quite coarse. It may attach to the overall presence or absence of a segment, but not individual sort of conditioning factors like whereabouts it occurs in terms of the segmental or prosodic context. And also this idea that there's a lack of uniform evaluation, which again echoes other issues. So there's been a number of papers which highlight the fact that these indexical values are subject to interpretation, reinterpretation, which really contrasts with the quite orderly community level change that we find. So indexical values are very individual specific, very variable, whereas change tends to be quite regular in the speech community at least. So there's a bit of a tension there between those two aspects. So more generally, it does call into question the role that social meaning does play in, at least in producing these macroscopic patterns of change at the level of the community. And then in turn, these results lend support to theories that foreground more mechanical factors, things like density of communication, in terms of the propagation of change, at least. Thank you.